Hello. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our speakers. Welcome to anyone who is listening to us today. I'm Chiara Lovotti, associate with ISPI, and I'm pleased to welcome you all at this ISPI for Med panel on Syria. This week, you know, it marks the 10th anniversary of the Syrian uprising. Obviously, not much is left of the uprising itself. In March 2011, a group, thousands of young Syrians took the streets of Daraa, which came to be known as the Cradle of the Syrian uprising. And that protest eventually spread to most regions, districts and cities of Syria. Perhaps we can suppose Syrians were also partially inspired and pushed by events unfolding in North Africa, you know, on the wave of the so-called Arab uprisings. And the Syrians protested against dire economic situation, against corruption within the state institutions and the military, and against the brutalities committed by the Assad regimes. But their protest turned into a nightmare quite quickly. The more people went to the streets, the harsher it was the government's response, the repression by the government, and the uprising soon turned into a civil war which was driven, waved by the Islamic State. We know it, terrorists of ISIS exploited the Syrian chaos and divisions to establish a caliphate across Syria and Iraq that would be the home, in their intentions, to all Muslims in the world. Clearly, their intentions had nothing to do with that call for democracy of the young boys and girls mobilizing across the towns of Syria. And again, later on, another game changer was of the Syrian conflict was in 2015 when Russia entered the conflict to defend the Assad regime from its varied opposition. It entered the conflict alongside other international actors, among which Iran and Turkey, three players with very different interests, very different agendas, but it became perhaps the most determinant ones in shaping the destiny of the Syrian war. So from a popular mobilization to a civil war to an international conflict, the step was short, unfortunately. And in this picture, as I said, very little, if nothing is left about that open, honest, and legitimate call for freedom and rights of the Syrian uprising. On Monday, one Catholic-oriented Italian newspaper titled that Syria reminds of Jesus' Calvary, but one that has been lasting for 10 years. And I think it is precisely so. So the anniversary we're marking this week is the most horrible one. Syria is entering its 11th year of war, and I'm sure I speak for anyone else here when I say that we all would prefer not to have to deal with such a tragedy. On the other side, clearly our role is to keep talking about Syria, right? To keep the spotlight on this humanitarian catastrophe, and this is the least we can do. And I should thank and compliment my colleagues at ISPI on this panel. And today we have the opportunity to discuss about Syria with our guests who have extensive knowledge of the country, of its society, economics, and the international interests over it. They have all deep knowledge, deep comprehensive understanding of what happens on the ground and in the backstage, let's say. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you, in pure alphabetical order, of course, Joseph Daher, affiliate professor at the European University Institute in Fiesole. Welcome, Joseph. Abdullah Irfan, Senior Advisor and at the Diplomatic Dialogue Department of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Welcome, Abdullah. Dareen Khalifa, Senior Analyst for Syria at the International Crisis Group. Welcome, Khalifa, as well. and Reem Salahi, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, dear Reem. So before starting and plunging into discussion, I should remind that after a few rounds of questions by myself, we will open to interaction with the audience. So please leave your questions in the chat, and I will read them. I know we have a big audience today, so you are a lot of people. I will do my best to collect as many questions as possible and to convey them to our speakers. So with no further hesitation, I will hand it over to Abdallah as the first speaker. And Abdullah, we have said that the conflict has been lasting for years. It has been evolving and changing a lot. Ceasefires have followed one another. Where do we stand now, 10 years after the outbreak of hostilities? Is the Syrian conflict at a standstill, in a deadlock? Most areas, we know it, have been retaken by the Assad regimes, those areas that were lost to the hands of the rebels. Some others are not. What are the prospects, especially for the resolution of the Idlib issue? Can you give us a picture or a sense of the security landscape in Syria as of today? Thank you, Abdallah.
Well, thank you very much, Chiara, and also thanks to my colleagues on the panel, Darine and Joseph and Reem. I look forward to learn a lot from you. I also look forward to get some questions from the generous audience here. Syria, after 10 years, what a difficult question to answer. I will do my best, and I will hand the cup to the rest of my colleagues as quick as I can. Looking into the indicators, Syria, we have many wounds. They're not bleeding, but they're still open, and this is the dilemma with everything. It is a conflict that is witnessing much lower levels of violence, but the real issues are still there. The government managed to overcome the defeats that has been taking place in 2011 till 15, thanks to the support of the Russian forces, but still the government is not controlling all over Syria. Around 65%, and the rest is distributed between different players, mainly in the northeast and the northwest. We have too many foreign players that none of them is able to defeat the other. And maybe also they're not willing to have a military confrontation. And actually, this is the crux of the matter. This is actually where we have the standstill. You have the Turks in the northwest and some parts of the northeast. You have the Americans. You have also the Russians, and you have the Syrian army, of course. Any confrontation will mean a traditional large-scale like war, and that is better avoided according to the calculations of the players. Syria, after 10 years, is not the primary concern for all of the players too. Turkey is maybe more focused on Libya. Syria is still important, but not number one issue. The US, also Syria was not really a priority for the US for a long time, but now it is even less prioritized. The same also for Russia. So that is basically the core issue, that we have an open conflict that no one is able to finish, and that's why it will be with us for quite some time. What will happen to Idlib? I believe that what will happen to Idlib is depends on the conversation between the big players, as it has been always the case. Most probably it will be a land swap, but part of a bigger framework that could be comprehensive or bilateral, depending on the situation. The Idlib is deeply connected also to the northeast. You have Turkey and Russia. Basically, these are the two primary players to decide on what really will happen. Given the big Turkish presence in Idlib at the moment, that is a factor to maintain the status quo for quite some time, unless something else happens. The American presence in the Northeast is also helping the Turks to really keep this strong position. We do not know what really will be the American new Syria policy. That is something to be revealed in the few coming weeks, hopefully. But from what we see, that they want to stay, and that is basically supporting the status quo argument. I probably stop here and be happy to hear from my colleagues.
Sure, thank you, Abdullah, for this broad picture on the evolutions of the conflict. Speaking of security and those areas that remain very volatile, Darine, I hand it over to you. You have been in the northeast and northwest of Syria recently. Can you share perhaps with us a few reflections of your latest visits? What is the reality on the ground? Does it reflect what Abdullah was saying as well? Can you share your experience with us? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Kara, and thank you, Abdullah, for the fascinating overview. I'll try to build on what Abdullah said and just zoom in a little bit about on the areas I managed to visit in the Northeast and the Northwest. I've been very fortunate that I was able to do that during very conflict. I think a few quick remarks on the North first. Basically, as Abdullah mentioned, it's been a year, or a bit over a year, since the U.S. pulled troops from areas west of Qamishli, northeast Syria, east towards the oil fields. It's also been a bit over a year since the Turkish incursion into northeast Syria, and since then we've had sort of stalemate. In the sense that in the aftermath of the Turkish incursion, the Syrian forces were able to reach an arrangement with Damascus in which the regime redeployed forces into areas that they haven't been for at least 4 years, including Raqqa, Tabqa, and Manbij. There's a lot of concern amongst the local population that the Kurdish leadership is offering these areas in a transaction of some sort, in a quid pro quo of some sort with Damascus in return for preserving their autonomy in Kurdish areas. The reality appeared to be very different. The redeployment of regime forces in the area came according to the rules and regulations or the boundaries put forward by the Kurdish leadership. So unlike other areas in Syria, the return of the regime was not associated with violence whatsoever. The return was very confined, and because the U.S. was able to leave a residual force farther east, this allowed the Syrian Democratic Forces, of course, to keep control over the area's natural resources, including oil, gas, and wheat. And this gave them a lot of leverage in both negotiations with Damascus, but also it allowed them to extract, use the resources to generate income, pay salaries for their military and civil administration. This was it was crucial for them to maintain the upper hand over security and governance. So we haven't seen defections at all from the SDF. On the contrary, because of the deteriorating economic situation in government-held areas, we are seeing a lot of defection coming from government areas to the northeast. So state employees, teachers, doctors, even fighters are defecting from or leaving their positions with the government and going to work with the SDF. So it was really remarkable to see that. I was able to visit Raqqa, and it was really, for me, remarkable because I was able to visit the city right after it was captured from ISIS in 2017, and it was a ghost town. Every single building was destroyed. And it was really amazing to see it today and how much the level of construction that happened. Over 70% of the city, the administration extended water and electricity over 70% of the city. It's really become a hub in a market. It's bustling, and the very little ISIS activities, hardly any left. So it's quite secure. People feel secure. I felt secure enough to walk in the streets and like sit in coffee shops. So it really is fascinating to see the like how little investment from the US and the international coalition really paid off in terms of security and stability of these areas. Now, big picture, taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture of the future of the Northeast, I had several conversations with the SDF leadership about that. And for me, what was noticeable is that there is consensus within the leadership that there is a need to de-escalate with Turkey. There is a need to find a detente of some sort with Turkey. However, there is, of course, a disagreement on how to pursue that. So there's one camp within the SDF that sees that the best way forward is via Syria, is to find a detente between northeast Syria and Turkey directly. And then you have another camp within the SDF that still thinks that there needs to be an answer to the broader Kurdish-Turkish question, which would include northern Iraq and southeast Turkey as well. So they look at it from a PKK Turkey angle. And despite that disagreement, as I said, there is no disagreement that there's just a need to pursue that de-escalation one way or another. One quick point on the Northeast, of course, the ceasefires have been holding in the Northeast since October 2019, largely thanks largely to a number of things, including US threatening to impose sanctions on Turkey. I think that was a key factor in Turkish calculations. But I worry about the ceasefire. I worry because increasingly Turkish officials have been saying that they preserve the right to respond to attacks emanating from northeast Syria on Turkish-controlled parts of Syria. And I think that's something that we need to keep a close eye on. There's been insurgent attacks coming from northeast Syria on Aleppo and also Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain areas under Turkish control now. And I think these attacks have the potential to pursue an escalatory cycle of violence. And there is a chance that Turkey might react or respond to these attacks in an aggressive way. So that's that on the Northeast. Quickly on the Northwest, and I know I don't have much time, and it's a very complex issue, hard to summarize in a few minutes. But thankfully, the ceasefire has been holding since March of last year. It's been holding longer than a lot of us have anticipated. That, of course, it goes thanks to Turkish military deterrence. That's been significant, yet it is unclear how efficient it would be on the long haul to maintain the ceasefire and to also address the broader jihadist question in Idlib, be it the HTS question or other Al-Qaeda offshoots operating in Idlib. Now, it was really good for me to visit Idlib during a ceasefire because all my previous visits to Idlib were happening during various offensives on the area. So it was really good to see people breathing and being able to go out not thinking when the next attack is going to happen. So that was really remarkable. Of course, the question of how long the ceasefire is going to hold is the predominant question on everyone's mind, be it HTS, the Salvation Government, or local population who I was able to speak to. And within HTS leadership, the way they look at this is that they need Turkish deterrence in order to maintain the ceasefire. And in order to maintain Turkish deterrence, in order to maintain Turkey's involvement in Idlib, they need to reposition themselves. They need to change how the world is perceiving them. So as a lot of you have noticed, they've been pursuing this media strategy, outreach strategy to reposition themselves as a local Syrian organization that no longer has transnational ties and objectives, that has shredded its connections with Al-Qaeda and other groups. So that's what IS is trying to work on today, that repositioning of their organizational ties and connections, trying to portray themselves as one more Syrian Islamist conservative group, yet not transnational in nature or objectives. Of course, the extent of that transformation is a matter of intense debate and controversy, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A if possible. I'll stop here and be to take any questions on that.
Thank you, dear Doreen, for such a comprehensive and detailed report of what you have seen. I should apologize with our audience because we are having a few technical issues. The most important thing, though, is that we grasp the content of what our panelists say, and I hope you managed to do that. Sorry for this. Now I hand it over to Reem Salahi of the Atlantic Council. Reem, as in any war, the Syrian people, Syrian citizens, are paying the highest price. Can you give us a broader picture of what are the humanitarian implications of such prolonged conflict, such ongoing instability and economic downturn? Please, Reem.
Sure. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak on this panel. To address the question, I think, I want to touch upon a few days ago, Geir Peterson, the UN Special Envoy, he stated that Syria will, quote, likely go down as one of the darkest chapters in recent history, with Syrians being the greatest victims of this century. And definitely, even though the numbers, we're pretty much very familiar with the numbers at this point after 10 years, when you stop and think about it, the numbers are, and the humanitarian consequences are extremely staggering. The Syrian conflict has undoubtedly been the deadliest in modern history. You have half the population which has been displaced, with 5.6 million refugees and 6.1 million IDPs. You have over 100,000 persons that have been disappeared or gone missing. It is estimated that around 500,000 persons have been killed in the conflict, but in reality, the real number is unknown, since the UN stopped counting years ago and has admitted that it is virtually impossible to verify the number of dead. You have a lot of the country, including agricultural land, that has been destroyed, either burnt or bombarded. And on top of this, on top of the death toll, the displacement, the missing and disappeared, we now have an incredible economic crisis impacting Syria of unprecedented scales. The Syrian lira has been dropping drastically, but this past year it's been devalued almost unprecedentedly. Whereas in the beginning, prior to the start of the conflict in 2011, the dollar was around 50 liras. And only just a year ago, it was 1,200 liras to the dollar. As of yesterday, it reached 4,600 liras to the dollar, with losing its value on a daily and sometimes hourly basis. And to put that into perspective, you have a government employee in Syria now receives anywhere between 30 to 90,000 Syrian liras a month, with the average being around 50,000 liras, which is equivalent to $11 a month. Beforehand, prior to 2011, the numbers that there would be no way that you'd have an employee that would be receiving $11 or at best $20 a month. But on the other hand, you have food items that have risen by 247%. And if we were to translate food prices to a dollar standard of living, for example, if an average paid employee made about $4,000 a month, 1 kilogram of beef, based on the prices in Syria, would be equivalent to around $800. A kilogram of sugar would be equivalent to $124. And so essentially individuals in Syria, people in Syria are basically just working multiple jobs often just to make enough money to buy basic food items. What we are seeing is that there has been an impact of the US-based Caesar sanctions. You have this economic crisis next door in Lebanon. You have widespread corruption that's only becoming worse because of the increase in food prices and the devaluation of the Syrian lira, and this ongoing conflict, resulting in even basic food items, previously subsidized food items like bread, becoming scarcities. And so what Darine mentioned is definitely also something that I've seen in my work in contacts with individuals in Turkish-held areas. I was told recently by individuals in Turkish-held areas that there has been an influx of individuals coming from regime areas seeking employment there because of the lack of salaries, the lack of money in regime-held areas. And even though Turkish-held areas, Euphrates Shield-held areas, the situation, the economic situation, the humanitarian situation is also extremely dire. If one was to manage to get a job with a local council there, the lowest salary that they would receive there would be around $70, whereas the best public sector salary in regime-held areas is around $20. And so, you can put that comparison there. The UN is estimating now that 80% of Syrians are living under the poverty line, and half of the population is food insecure. There is widespread unemployment, especially amongst displaced populations throughout Syria. And so what you have seen 10 years in is Syria has transformed from what was prior to 2011, a relatively food secure, a relatively well-off country where a large portion of the population was considered middle class and services were generally available, to what is now a failed state with a large majority of the population now living under the poverty line, struggling just to meet the basic food needs. And this economic downturn has hit all segments of society, even regime loyalists and individuals that are close to the regime. And it's been further exacerbated by younger populations and a lot of the technical professionals having fled the country. So you have really a major brain drain in addition to all of the other issues, the humanitarian consequences, the human rights consequences, the economic consequences. So sadly, I think basically, in short, what we are seeing in Syria 10 years in is a very, very grim outlook with it's unclear if how things will improve, but rather whether things will become even worse, with predictions that there might be a famine in the coming years. So I'll hand it back to you guys.
Thank you, dear Reem, for such a comprehensive and rich in information overview on the humanitarian implications of this tragedy. You mentioned a lot of aspects. Let's try to get a bit more in detail of some of them economically, especially with Joseph Daher, European University Institute. Joseph, you deal with economy specifically, which seems like it is perhaps the aspect that casts a shadow on Syria's future, right? Because even when and if the war will be over, Syria will be a devastated country. I don't know if we can even call it an economic crisis. I think it's beyond crisis. Do you agree with Reem's predictions? What do you foresee for Syria's recovering in a, I don't know what future? Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you for the invitation. And I can only concur, unfortunately, with Reem about the dramatic economic and social situation in Syria today. It's very much catastrophic, and the numbers she mentioned are telling on many aspects. What I could add is to see the destruction of the economy is the GDP that declined from a bit more than 60 billion in 2010 to 21.6 billion in 2019. The total accumulated loss was estimated at the end of 2019 to more than 530 billion US dollars. So just to give you the amount of economic loss we're talking about, and obviously the Lebanese financial crisis that we will come back to, and the global nature of the pandemic only worsened the problems of the Syrian population, especially the popular classes. And the inflation just reached its highest level in 2020, being 130% from July 19 to July 2020. So there's been a dramatic erosion of the purchasing power of the Syrian people, as very well explained by Reem, and therefore remittances in general. And this is something I think we should study a bit more. Remittances in Syria, mostly done through informal channel, have become kind of a safeguard for the vast majority of the Syrian people, because people sending even $100 per month, it's maybe 10 times the average salary of a Syrian public employee, or even in the private sector as well. And there were a couple of estimates saying that between 50 to 70% of the Syrian people today are dependent on these kind of informal remittances. Already prior to the uprising, remittances were growing through the 2000s. And this, we haven't talked also about the destructions and in education, health, and the lowering of the standards in these sectors. So it's very hard to see, unfortunately, a way out of the wars and destruction, but also the political economic orientation of the regime, because and I could add also the sanctions. But coming back to the political economic orientation of the regime, very often people speak about war economy or economy in a wartime as a complete break with what was happening in 2011. Actually, what we witnessed is a deepening of former neoliberal policies that had impoverished massively the Syrian people, because we shouldn't forget that there's been a process of vast impoverishment that occurred throughout the 2000s. Syria in 2010, you had, according to various estimates, around 33% of people living under the poverty line and 50% just over. And actually, the regime continued in deepening neoliberal policies through its new so-called national partnership strategy, what was presented as the new economic strategy of the regime in 2016, and in which public-private partnership is a key element of this. And in this public-private partnership, what is pushed forward is a privatization of wide sectors of the economy, which was already occurring in 2000, and that will benefit particular businessmen that are connected to the regime, or foreign allies as Russia and Iran, even though for the moment it's still very much limited, we should acknowledge, because of the dear economic situation in Syria, and also because of the sanctions. Just as when we come to the housing, land, and property, is also new ways to accumulate forms of capital, but also to guarantee or to push forward some security objective, obviously. And therefore, what we witness today of the Syrian economy is that the productive sectors of the economy have been even more hit than prior to 2010. And it was already, the importance in the Syrian economy were diminishing. Today, the vast majority of new businessmen that have risen are involved as intermediaries or as traders. Today, Syria is not producing a lot of things. Just to give you an example, the export prior to the uprising in 2010 was reaching a bit more than 11 billion US dollars. Today, it does not exceed 700 million USD. So just to give you a few examples, while it is still very massively importing foreign products. So Syria is more and more becoming a quasi-exclusive consumption society, which is it's a main problem if you want to speak of any kind of economic recovery. So this is a deepening of what we witnessed throughout the 2000s. And the war obviously had an important role in it, but also the political economic orientation of the regime in this way. And I think this is important. So because it's very hard to see an economic recovery with this particular nature of the regime, which is patrimonial in many aspects, and in which businessmen, a very little minority of people, are benefiting from the policies of the regime, and especially the neoliberal policies, while the vast majority are being hit very hard. Also, we've seen throughout the last decade a diminution in the value of subvention. So therefore, if we need a true economic recovery, this means a necessity of a democratic form of transition, more transparency, but more democratic rights in general, and an economic development that is based on the needs and the interest of the large majority of Syrians, and not a small minority. And in this perspective, obviously, the redevelopment of the productive sectors of the economy is much needed, because wages today only account for around 20% of the national income in Syria, while rent, profits is the rest. So you cannot build an economic recovery on this kind of statistic. Obviously, another element to take into account, which is will prevent in the future any kind of economic recovery, is the issue of sanctions, even though it's not at the center of it.
Thank you, dear Joseph. Thank you very much. You mentioned high inequalities, and I will like to ask Abdullah if an opinion on sanctions specifically, because there is a huge debate on the effectiveness of sanctions and who is paying the highest price, the regime or the people. I might have an opinion, but it's not to me to answer. Abdullah, can you give us your 2 cents on this? I should ask to be quite short this time, a couple of minutes, so that we have some time to open to the public. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Chiara, for the very easy question. Yeah, sanctions extremely debated, and it comes with the hard positions. But here I want to differentiate between the functions of the sanctions and the effectiveness and the consequences. Sanctions not meant to hurt anyone but the perpetrators, and then that should be in a bargaining framework. Basically, we impose sanctions, we expect some change, and then we lift sanctions after that change is there. The question comes after 10 years of imposing sanctions, how effective they are in achieving the goal. They're not effective in achieving the goal. This is obviously clear. But the question here related to the consequences. Can we blame sanctions for everything happening in Syria or not? This is the difficult question. So here I'm separating between the miserable situation that we all agree on, and then the contribution of sanctions into that miserable situation. If you look closely to the Syrian economy, you discover that sanctions is one probably out of 4 or even more other factors that contributing to the situation. And that actually needs more study. Joseph discussed the government policies. If you add to that the Lebanese economic crisis, if you add to that the war itself, if you have a factory that is destroyed by a bomb, regardless who bombed it, whom to blame for not reconstructing it? You know, the war destroyed it. It's not sanctions. You see what I'm getting at? I'm here not saying that we do not have an economic crisis in Syria. We have an economic crisis, and of course the Syrians are suffering the most. But who is responsible for the suffering? Is it the war? Is it the government policies? Is it sanctions? Or the Lebanese economic crisis? This is something is totally unclear to researchers and, of course, to policymakers. The last point is, if sanctions effect is unclear, of course, lifting it, I mean, the consequences or the impact of lifting it will also be unclear. So if we lift sanctions tomorrow, Joseph maybe can answer that. You think that the situation will be significantly better or slightly better, maybe some sectors, some other sectors not. And then the other question after that will be, given the relative economic benefit of completely lifting sanctions tomorrow, what would be the political cost for that? What signal that is giving, and what future Syria will have? If it is bright future and democracy and prosperity will come again, probably I would totally agree on lifting sanctions. But also, I'm not saying that sanctions still should stay there forever. There should be something in between, and I probably stop here.
Thank you, Abdallah. Thank you very much for your answers. Sure, this is a huge topic, lot of debates on it, and no easy answers inside. I will give an opportunity to Joseph to answer later if he wishes. Now I will turn to Darine. It has been mentioned, of course, Russia. Russia has intervened back 6 years ago almost, and it has changed the fate of the Syrian conflict, right? What assessment can we make of 6 years Russian campaign in Syria? You mentioned the role of international players before and how sometimes they do not correspond to concrete achievements, improvements in terms of security in the ground. Would you like to elaborate a bit on that? And also concerning Turkey, if you which is more active in the areas that you have visited recently, 10 years on, what is driving Turkey's involvement in Syria? Please, Darine, 2-3 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me start by the latter part of your question. On Turkey, so Turkey today is the main enabler of the ceasefire in Idlib. It's also the main potential spoiler of the ceasefire in the northeast. So as you said, it is the key actor in northern Syria. It is the Turkish policy is driven primarily by security concerns. It sees northern Syria as a national security concern. It sees Idlib as a major national security concern. The way Ankara looks at Idlib is a potential wave of refugees coming their way. So their entire military investment in Idlib is driven by the fact that they don't think they can absorb more refugees. Turkey already has over 4 million refugees. There's consensus along the political spectrum in Ankara that the country can't take or absorb anymore coming their way from Idlib. Now, similarly, they look at the Northeast as a national security concern, however, for different reasons. Of course, they see the YPG, the backbone of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the key fighting force within the Syrian Democratic Forces, as an extension of a Kurdish militant group, the PKK, which has been fighting an insurgency in Turkey for the last 40 years. And so for them, Northeast Syria and American protection offered to the YPG and to the SDF offers their mortal enemy an ability to create what for them looks like a statelet south of their border, and it is something that they are adamantly working to ensure is not sustainable. So to conclude, northern Syria, or Syria we write for Turkey now, is a national security concern, and everything they're doing in northern Syria is driven by that. Now to Russia, a more complicated player in Syria. Of course, Russia's strategy has been quite successful. They managed to restore Assad's grip and control. So, and on that front, they were quite successful. Of course, they inserted themselves as a key player politically and militarily in Syria, which is a huge success. However, today, and as Abdullah laid out, Russia is running up against a lot of international investment, be it from Turkey or from the US. So I think in the next few years, Russia is going to be facing some complications and a bit of a conundrum, to use the title of this panel, in the sense that the Reconquista strategy is running up against really a lot of investment. And also the reconciliation strategy is running up against the brick wall, because neither party left in the conflict is willing to reconcile or surrender Damascus the way it happened elsewhere in Syria. A third problem Russia is going to be facing is lack of Western reconstruction money. I think there was a widespread belief in Moscow that if there would be a push in the political process of some sort, an inconsequential meeting to discuss the Constitutional Committee, that would be a stepping stone towards easing in Western reconstruction money. Of course, they are gradually and increasingly realizing that Western reconstruction money is not going to come to Syria anytime soon, not without concrete changes in the regime that I don't think Russia is going to be able or willing to deliver on. So that's huge. also on a number of other things, including sanction reversal or normalization with Damascus, even if some Western countries see the value in normalizing with Damascus or see the value in reversing sanctions for humanitarian reasons. I think the political cost of that is incredibly high, and is not going to be happening anytime soon for a number of reasons that we can get into. So all these things combined, I think, offer a lot of complications for Russian presence in Syria and for their overall strategy in Syria, and it is something that they're going to have to grapple with in the next few years. Back to you, Kiara.
Thank you, Darine. Totally agree with you. The question now about Russia is what is next? What is the next phase you wish to implement? Reem, Joseph was mentioning this. At the end of the day, everything is connected, and any achievement and improvement in terms of economics as well is connected to improvements on the political stage. In this sense, a process has been initiated by the United Nations, UN-led process to rewrite to the constitutional reform. How you've been observing the work of the United Nations for a long. Where do we stand with that? Can you give us a picture on where this process is going? Thank you.
Sure. So I think, unfortunately, at 16 months and after 5 sessions, the UN-facilitated constitutional talks are pretty much dead in the water. The regime delegation is neither empowered nor willing to make any compromises. So it seems like they're just running the clock on irrelevant procedural non-issues. Most recently, after the most recent session, I was told that the head of the regime delegation, Ahmed Kizbari, sent to the UN Special Envoy Peterson a procedural paper that was extremely convoluted and complicated, and similarly didn't touch on any substantive matters or constitutional matters, and this was being proposed to be discussed in future meetings. So we're now 16 months in, we're nowhere near discussing matters related to the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, which calls for a political settlement in Syria, or even discussing constitutional principles or a rewriting of the current constitution. I also think it's safe to say that no major power, whether it's Russia or the US, actually believe that anything will come out of the Constitutional Committee or the UN-based facilitated constitutional talks. But for them, it is the only show in town. It is the only political process, Geneva-based process. So the hope is to keep that alive, just to buy time until something else can come along potentially. It's also a way for the major powers to continue to place pressure on the regime and keep them engaged through in an international process. But this definitely puts the UN's credibility on the line. The longer this process continues and nothing comes out of it, the UN already is viewed as a non-neutral or effective actor in Syria. And unfortunately, these UN facilitated talks are only exacerbating the frustration that many Syrians feel with the UN. But even most recently, again, at the 10th anniversary, Special Envoy Peterson acknowledged again that there has been no compromise between incompatible political visions, and those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity continue to enjoy near total impunity in Syria. And so that doesn't seem to have changed or been addressed with this most recent variation of UN facilitated talks. It's also worth noting that when Peterson first came into his position, he didn't want to limit his engagement to just the Syrian Constitutional Committee process, but he also wanted to focus on other issues, including most notably the issue of detainees. But he has not been successful in addressing those issues either. So what we're basically left with is the Astana process, which I think is the only viable process now in Syria. and it's a military process. It's not meant to address the underlying political and social issues that this conflict is based upon. As you rightly noted in the beginning, this was an uprising turned conflict, and it was based on political and social rights, and millions of Syrians demanding improved social and political rights. And now we have economic issues on top of those issues that we discussed earlier. And so Astana is not meant to address any of those issues, but it is the only viable process that has really emerged out of the past 10 years. And another reality that we also need to think about or consider when looking at the political processes is that the conflict in Syria is no longer an inter-Syrian conflict. Syria has become the staging ground for many other regional powers and international brokers, as Abdullah rightly discussed earlier on, between Turkey and the PYD, YPG, Iran and the Gulf states, Iran and Israel, Russia and Iran, Russia and the US, and the list goes on and on. So that is also something that needs to be thought about when we're trying to figure out how do we come to some sort of conclusion when it comes to Syria, and whether the constitutional talks, even though they're not really going anywhere at this point, whether they are enough to really help us reach a conclusion when it comes to finding a solution on or a resolution to the Syrian conflict.
Thank you, Reem. I would ask one last question to Joseph before opening to the audience. Joseph, there is one actor that we didn't mention, and perhaps there is a reason why no one came up with the European Union. In terms of the reconstruction business, which is one of the challenges ahead of for Syria in the next years, what do you think that could be the role of the European Union, meaning both the supranational body and European governments, if there is any wish to contribute to Syria's reconstruction? Because that is, of course, a very much politically charged question, but it's also a question that we cannot ignore. And I know you have worked extensively on this. Can you give us your 2 cents and your opinion? Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. Obviously, this is a very important question. The problem is that, first of all, is the issue of the Syria sanction that prevents, on many aspects, the European Union to going forward regarding any kind of reconstruction project in Syria. Because as I recall, would like to remind everyone that the Syria sanctions target anyone directly or indirectly that would help in a reconstruction process in Syria, basically. And just to come back maybe on the issue of sanctions, to make clear my opinion on this, it's not about no sanctions or full sanctions. It's about what kind of sanctions we're talking about. Obviously, the sanctions targeting, institutions, individuals that have committed war against humanity must continue. And what we're witnessing in Germany and other countries of Europe, this is very good. And I think the European Union, this is one of the things they could push forward. But when we come to the more general system of sanctions, this is problematic because it's affecting not directly the regime, and very often businessmen connected to the regime can bypass these sanctions. They have the abilities through smuggling networks, through their own kind of security services network, but this kind of sanctions, which is affecting the population of Syria, the productive sectors of Syria, manufacturing and agriculture, and the humanitarian work. For example, we're talking about the sanctions. One of the things that the European Union could do, but again, it's very difficult because the Caesar sanction has this ability. It's similar very much to the Iranian sanctions. Therefore, you have, for example, Caesar sanction are deepening the problem when it comes to transfers of money through humanitarian organization to Syria. And we even saw, a couple of European closing the bank accounts of NGOs working on Syria, whether being Syrian or not, or French, British, etc., they had their bank accounts basically closed by the financial institution because of the risking process, because of the fear of falling under US sanctions. So this, and this is very well documented. At the same time, the general sanctions, and obviously Caesar sanctions have deepened these kind of problems, are affecting humanitarian work on the ground. I know a certain amount of INGOs, NGOs, unable to have access to the transfer of money they have in their bank account in Europe, for example. Or the money is not coming in. The banks in Europe don't want to send to Syria because of the fear of falling under US sanctions and OFAC sanctions, etc., and putting, a danger programs on the ground that are delivering assistance to Syrians. And even INGO had to diminish the number of employees because of these kind of sanctions. When it comes to reconstruction, I think, again, it's not about supporting any kind of reconstruction process that is promoted by the Syrian government, which is very much based basically on luxurious real estate construction. If we look at Marota city for the moment, so it's very much for particular sectors of the Syrian society, but it should be targeting, the people that suffered from the wars. And again, to say, I think it is all these kind of reasons, whether it be wars and destruction, economic policies of the regime, and sanctions that are putting, the catastrophic economic situation today in Syria. But I think for the European Union, what could be thought is a framework of condition for international funding, where you have a participation of the local people, of the IDPs and the refugees in a possible construction plans, where you have transparent budgets, effective respect for workers' rights, and further conditions preventing or limiting the use of such funds for regime or businessmen connected to the regime. And we've seen this kind of problem already in humanitarian assistance. Obviously, this should be done on a micro project. I'm not talking about, big project, but this could be a show of flexibility, I think. But again, this is very complicated because of the current political situation. But I think if we show a bit of flexibility and target a very small project at the beginning, for example, the reconstruction of a particular neighborhood, etc., these are ideas that we could put forward. Obviously, I'm in support as well for the European Union of continuing the support for local initiatives, NGOs, that are acting in Syria, that are independent, or in neighboring countries. I think this is very important. Also, maybe assisting in particular programs for economic recovery, targeting more especially productive sectors of the economy or empowerment of women. I think this is very important issues to continue. But again, it's very complicated because of the current political situation and the nature today of the Caesar sanctions.
Thank you, Joseph. Very clear. Thank you. I now have to rush in a bit. I have collected a few questions from our audience. They are not addressed to anyone specifically, so I will just read them and then allow for one last round of answers from you, okay? And you feel free to react to any of these comments. So I managed to gather 5 questions. The first 4 questions. The first is from Nureddin Chakroun. Sorry for the mispronunciation. Nureddin is asking about the rumors about the reintegration of Syria into the Arab League, and from that into progressive reintegration into the international community. And Nureddin is asking, to what extent do you assess that this scenario is possible without a regime change? Then someone else with no name is asking about supposing that the international key players will reach any kind of arrangement for the Syrian political future. Will the Syrians accept this, and will the Syrians accept to be ruled again by Bashar al-Assad? So somehow related to the first one as well. Third question, what steps are currently being taken to seek justice for the victims of the war? And to this, I would like to abuse my position as a chair to ask Darine specifically about, on the other side, the perpetrators. Darine has worked as well on social issues of the Syrian conflict. what about the ISIS former fighters that have been released from detention facilities and that will have to reintegrate into Syria's fragile, devastated society? And finally, Fabrizio Eva is asking for a bit more of elaboration on the Kurdish issue and the Rojava. I will repeat the same order as before. So starting from Abdullah. Abdullah, if you want to react to any of these comments, you are free to do that, please.
Actually, no. I would like to thank the audience for their very interesting questions, and I believe that my colleagues are better suited to address them.
Thank you, dear. We have a few minutes, so I appreciate. So the next one should be Dareen, if I'm not mistaken.
All right, so let me get the question on the ISIS returnees. So, I mean, in the process, in the war against ISIS, in the process of recapturing areas by the Syrian Democratic Forces, large number of ISIS fighters were detained by the Syrian Democratic Forces, and thousands of associated family members were put in detention facilities or detention camps. So early on, I had a conversation with the Kurdish leadership back in 2017, and they made it really clear that their strategy is going to be a very lenient one. So they're going to issue as many amnesties as they possibly can in return for pledging of allegiance, if I may say. So entire towns and villages were given amnesties despite being part of members of ISIS or the ISIS bureaucracy. So they were either fighters or taking part in ISIS in different ways. And this strategy really was a way to avoid antagonizing the local population. The Kurdish leadership realized that they're the minority. They don't want vendettas with the majority Arab tribal communities. So they thought the best way forward is to issue these amnesties and just keep them closer to them. So that's exactly what happened. They released hundreds of people, some of which were incorporated in the Syrian Democratic Forces. So they were given a chance to become members of the Syrian Democratic Forces and be on their payroll. And that was a way to keep an eye on them. And then afterwards, after the last battle against ISIS in Hajin and Baghuz, the numbers just increased in a way that was very significant, and it was also beyond the capacity of the SDF to contain. So they, again, said, we are going to keep the families in camps, but the plan is to gradually release them based on tribal deals. So tribal members would go to the SDF leadership, ask them for a list of names, and then the SDF would release these names under the auspices or under the protection of tribal communities, which they gave it the name of a tribal reconciliation. However, there wasn't really a reconciliation process in place, let alone a rehabilitation one. So what has been happening is that they've been releasing large numbers of people because they're just stretched thin and they don't have the capacity to keep them in these detention facilities. But there isn't a clear strategy to rehabilitate these people. So they're becoming increasingly a burden on the local population, who are prepared to receive them, but are also economically impoverished themselves and incapable of containing such a responsibility. So it really is a dilemma, because keeping these people in makeshift detention facilities is a sustainable solution. It's not something that SDF has the resources to do, but also releasing them in numbers puts a huge burden on the local population. So it's really a major problem in the Northeast, and it's something I think requires a lot of international attention and support. There's been a lot of attention to the issue of internationals, but I'm glad you asked about the Syrians specifically, because this is a completely overlooked issue, and it is something that we can't count on one faction to be able to resolve unilaterally.
Thank you, Dareen. Reen, do you also want to react? the comments?
Sure. So I'll just very briefly discuss as far as the question on what steps have been taken for justice for victims. I mean, one thing to note is that Syrian civil society is probably one of the most active civil societies that that has emerged from recent conflicts, and they have done an incredible job, especially organizations, family associations, and others based in Europe, in really trying to find some version of justice and accountability for the crimes that have been committed in Syria. In 2014, I think it was 2014, there was an attempt to refer Syria to the ICC. It was vetoed by Russia and China. And so I think at this point in the years in the years following, there has been a lot of very creative efforts using universal jurisdiction, and other international treaties, including the Convention Against Torture, to really try to bring some sort of justice and accountability in national courts and even international courts. And so these processes are ongoing. They're still very much in the early stages. We just recently had a verdict, a landmark verdict in Germany related to an agent, somebody who was involved in the security branches in Syria, Iyad, who received 4.5 years as somebody who's was involved in these crimes against humanity. But this is just the beginning, and there's almost on a regular basis of lawsuits that are being filed. There was recently something that was filed in Moscow as well. And so there have been a lot of attempts to use national courts through universal jurisdictions and other mechanisms, treaty-based mechanisms, to try to achieve justice for victims of the war. But there's a lot more that needs to be done just because of the scale of human rights violations that have emerged in the last 10 years. And if I could just very briefly note the question on whether Syrians will accept being ruled again by Bashar al-Assad. I mean, the reality is that the regime at this point is using the more the economic situation and the lack of the lack of services that it's able to provide to the population, the more repressive its tactics have become. And so it's not so much a willingness, but at this point, a lack of ability to defy the regime that is forcing individuals to stay silent. But the question really is, for how much longer, when the very basic necessities of life are no longer available to Syrians? When will Syrians stay quiet, or will it cause another uprising, but this time, rather than uprising for social and political rights, just an uprising for basic livelihood to survive? And so I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about an ultimate resolution to this conflict. And I'll hand it over to my other colleagues.
Thank you, Reem. Thank you so much. Totally agree with you. For how longer can the Syrians remain silent and accept this? We know actually mobilization and protests have already occurred last summer, for instance. So showing that this, the result we are going through is not a sustainable one. Joseph, you have the last word, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just like to add on what Reem said. I think it's absolutely key to have transitional justice and accountability. We have a neighbor that is Lebanon that has the worst case. There has been no accountability, and therefore you can see that the warlords continue to rule the country, and you can see the result. And unfortunately, I think this might happen in the case of Syria. So what is happening in Europe and what was mentioned is very important. I think the problem is not about accepting or not the regime. It's about Syrians, and has been mentioned before, have no kind of role in the decision making today of the future of Syria. For the vast majority, even basically on the regime side, it's foreign powers deciding on many aspects for the future of Syrians, and this is very problematic. And as you were saying, Chiara, we've witnessed increasingly social protests since a year in various areas, in former opposition-held areas, and it's still occurring, for example, in Dar'a, but also in Rif Dimashq in Damascus province. But we also witnessed it in regions that are considered more loyalist, like coastal areas, and increasing forms of criticism against the regime. And the regime has lots of difficulty to reimpose a form of passage hegemony. on its territories it controls. But the problem is that these social protests are very much isolated one from the other, no connection, and there's no political alternative today. The opposition is considered as bad or as corrupted on many aspects, or what we witness from various of the opposition. And again, I think when we talk about accountability and crimes, everyone should be targeted, and the opposition has committed crimes on this aspect, and we shouldn't forget it. But this is the real problem, where you can protest, but what kind of alternative can you give to the people? And I will finish on this because no one talked about, or there's this question, the Kurdish issue. This is very much, I think, a symbol of the problem of large sectors of the Syrian opposition. The Syrian opposition, the Syrian regime, has the similar position when it comes to the Kurdish issue, very much an heritage of Arab nationalist, exclusive form of identity. And therefore, I, for example, support a form of self-determination, which does not mean separation. It means that you build a new Syria where you don't have a form of supremacist ethnic identity, Arabism, and which all the Syrians are inclusive. And I think this is very much a symbol. If we don't go forward from this, and it also needs a socio-economic, inclusive kind of political program that is today lacking. So I think we're unfortunately entering a form of continuous instability for the regime, but it needs much more than this to defy it on a larger level, I would say.
Thank you, Joseph, for being brief and touching on these issues, the Kurdish issue, and as you say, the lack of alternatives, perhaps one of the biggest overarching problems. Now we should really close. I wish to thank you, our guests, our audience, for their contribution and for being so patient. We ran over time. I do apologize about that. Thank you to everyone, and I hope we will be able to meet soon, keep talking about Syria, hopefully in person and not on Zoom. Thank you very much on behalf of ISPI and the Rome Dialogues. Thank you.